Hey there guys, I'm Turkey, and welcome back to my god-honest attempt to trick people into liking the Blight as much as I do. So I have people to yell at when I want to talk about the Blight for 45 minutes straight. This is a summary of Talbot's entire life from start to finish that includes everything we know so far about him as a character. I hope you enjoy. Talbot Grimes is a Scottish chemist who is most notably known for his unwavering ambition and his willingness to cross any line as long as he believes that it will achieve his goal. There were a lot of people on his time on Earth that saw this morally questionable determination and tried to use it for their own advantage. When Talbot was a child, he was playing with a patch of foxglove and was made extremely ill from it, and instead of feeling fear or wariness from the plants, he instead felt fascination. From then on, his passion and interest for chemistry was awakened, and he set forward on a path to become a chemist. He attended the London School of Medicine and graduated in 1838, being reprimanded during his time there for grave robbing, so that he could conduct unsanctioned experiments on their bodies. He was plucked straight from school and recruited for the British East India Company, where in 7 years he rose among the ranks and became the head chemist. During his time there, he created a drug that increased productivity and lessened people's need for sleep so that they could work longer hours. Unbeknownst to him, this drug was extremely dangerous, but was produced and given to factory workers anyway. Talbot was rewarded with his own private underground laboratory beneath a prison camp from the Opium War on an island off the coast of India. He was tasked to create a drug that would allow soldiers to withstand inhuman amounts of pain, and began experimenting on prisoners of the Opium War. The drug didn't show any prominent side effects at the time, so like his productivity drug, it was produced and handed out without being properly tested. There were rumors that some soldiers had gone crazy and massacred entire villages, but Talbot didn't believe them, assuming that they were exaggerated war stories. Talbot had no idea that during the time he was performing his morally questionable experiments and producing these poorly tested drugs that he was accumulating enemies that wanted to see him dead. During a trip to a city, he was knocked unconscious and kidnapped by a sick man and transported to a mass grave filled with hundreds of bodies, all people killed by his productivity drug. Talbot couldn't argue or defend himself and accepted his fate when the man beat him nearly to death with a steel pipe. He was thrown into the grave and left to die. He tried to crawl away but was too weak and collapsed in front of a dead woman with dazzling hazel eyes. This image would haunt him forever. He waited for death, but it never came. This is when the Mystics, or the Entity Cult, found him. It seems to be implied that they'd been keeping an eye on him for an unknowable amount of time, considering the fact that they knew who and where he was in time to save him. He was taken to the Mystics' ancient school that was posing as a monastery. At the school, the Mystics were posing as monks, and were using ancient knowledge they'd accumulated with the intent to expand the human mind and find a way to open doors to other dimensions, believing that they were all interconnected with each other. Talbot agreed to help the Mystics with their research until his recovery was complete to pay back their kindness for saving him, but when he was shown knowledge and scientific formulas that far surpassed his own knowledge, his interest in the work became obsession. He was tasked to research a chemical created in the pineal gland of the human mind that they called the soul chemical. The Mystics believed that the chemical was the key to unlocking doors between worlds. Talbot dreamt of ushering humanity into a new period of enlightenment. Maybe then that would be enough to make up for the wrongs that he'd done in his life, and maybe those hazel eyes that still haunted him would leave his mind. For some reason we don't know yet, the Mystics turned on Talbot right as he was reaching a breakthrough. I can only assume that it was because he intended to share his research with the world and not hoard the knowledge to himself and the elite few. The Mystics drugged him and kidnapped him in his sleep. He was taken to an opium den and dropped there. When he awoke, he was dazed and confused, and started desperately searching for his research. A mystic returned every time he woke and drugged him over and over again, leaving his mind foggy and him unable to move or leave. This is when the entity began whispering to him. The entity began telling him wondrous things. He grabbed a stone and began carving his research from memory into the walls while listening intently to the promises the entity made. He wrote for hours and hours until his fingers bled and he covered every square inch of the floor and walls. When he ran out of room, he began carving the words into his chest. The entity opened a portal to the realm before him and showed him a field of pustula flowers, beckoning him to enter with the promise of boundless research and knowledge in worlds beyond human comprehension. When the other occupants of the opium den awoke, they looked around and discovered that Talbot had not been writing his research all over the walls, but instead he wrote a single message that was repeated over and over again. Death is only the beginning. This is where his story gets interesting. I should preface all of this with, Talbot's lore is very confusing, and isn't in any discernible order, and we have no way to know when any of this happened or for how long. There are a lot of assumptions that I have to make, so take this all with a grain of salt. We will learn more during the Halloween events to come, so some of it will eventually be outdated or retconned. Talbot was now in the entity's realm willingly, but once he arrived, he understood the weight of his decision and knew that he had been manipulated into entering the realm. Now trapped for eternity, he set out to discover a way to escape. Talbot wandered between realms in a sort of out-of-bounds area of the entity's realm until he stumbled upon an abandoned shack that used to be home to Vigo, an inventor who had experimented on the pustula flowers that the entity had promised Talbot. He found Vigo's journal and was fascinated with what he found inside. He picked up where Vigo left off and began experimenting on pustula nectar, a nectar secreted by pustula plants, a plant that grew every year during Halloween when the entity became weakened and was afflicted with a sickness called the Blight. This nectar contained the raw power of the entity itself, and if treated correctly, could be used to open portals between worlds and even be used to escape. Not to mention it could give the subject inhuman powers, like incredible speed and inhuman strength. Talbot wasn't as safe as he'd hoped. He was regularly attacked and chased away from the lab by killers that roamed the realm between trials, and during one particularly rough attack, a killer injured his arm. He managed to barely get away with his life, but he returned to the lab anyway, determined to find a way to escape the realm. During one of his experiments, he injected a serum he'd created into a dead rat, and the rat came back to life, biting down on his wounded arm and infecting him with Blight. This is where his addiction to Blight began. He quickly went mad from the substance, losing his memories and sense of self, all of his inhibition and reserves leaving him before he knew what was happening. When the killer who injured him returned, Talbot attacked, capturing him and chaining him in a cellar under the lab. He blacked out, but when he awoke, the killer was crying and yelling from the cellar. Talbot was floored by the power he experienced when he took down the killer. This is when he decided he would perform his experiments on the killers that wandered the realm. He began injecting himself with his serums to make himself stronger and feel that power again, his addiction worsening every day. His serums gave him incredible strength and speed that made him extremely dangerous, and no killer was any match for him. Over the course of the Blight, he created 33 serums. The Blight was coming to an end and he was running out of time. He created his final serum, Compound 33, and prayed that it would facilitate his escape from the realm. He traveled to the Void and injected himself with it. It didn't work. He fled the Void and returned to his lab, getting back to work immediately. He created Compound 34, but was supposedly found by the entity before he could use it. The entity took him and banished him to the Void to rot. For some reason, perhaps from the power that his serums and the addiction to Blight gave him, he rose from the Void. He wandered around the Void for an unknown amount of time, confused and terrified, and vividly hallucinated getting killed over and over by his unknown at the time victims. He pleaded with the entity for nectar. The entity began putting him in trials as a killer and a survivor. He wandered the Void between trials, just waiting for the next one and searching for pustula nectar. The entity saw his potential as a killer and tested him, putting him in a field of dying people, giving him a weapon and telling him that if he killed everyone, he would get his serum. He did it without question. When he was done, he pleaded for serum from the entity. The mystics appeared before him, surrounding him. He confronted them, accusing them of condemning him to his suffering. The entity trapped him with tendrils and injected him with serum. Finally, he was given what he had always wanted. But when he had had enough, the entity didn't stop. It injected his body with more serum than the human body could withstand, and he had a severe overdose. His body mutated and deformed in an attempt to keep Talbot alive. The mystics told Talbot that he had condemned himself. Talbot was turned into the Blight and dropped into a trial, now doomed to endure trial after trial of killing survivors for just one more drop of the serum that had infested his mind and body, and turned him into someone that he no longer recognized. We have no idea if the man that Talbot was is still inside of the Blight's mind, and we may never know for sure. Only time will tell. So far, that is the complete story of Talbot Grimes, or the Blight. Even though Talbot is the most lore-heavy character in Dead by Daylight, he's also the most misunderstood and underappreciated. People also think he's an old man for some reason, probably because his weapon is a cane. Despite graduating in 1838, presumably as an 18-year-old, meaning he was born in around 1820, he was taken during the Second Opium War, which was in 1856, so he's most likely 36 years old, if not a day over 40 at most. He was wealthy during his time in the real world, as his cosmetics imply, and canes were a symbol of wealth and status back then. The description of his weapon even says it is for killing, not for walking, plus he just looks young in his cutscenes, so I have no idea where this comes from, but that's just a pet peeve of mine. Talbot Grimes is a morally gray chemist who is the true definition of the ends justify the means. Talbot is an objectively moral character with the best interest of humanity in mind, and every terrible thing he did was ultimately for the betterment of mankind. That that's what makes him such an interesting character to me, his willingness to do anything to help others, and his slow descent into madness when it goes horribly wrong. I would love to see more people interested in him as a character, which is why I made this video. Please leave your theories and predictions for the future of his story in the comments below, and tell me if you think that he is going to be the man who discovers how to escape the entity's realm once and for all. Thank you all so much for watching. Peace.